like to welcome you to this evening's lecture, part of the 2023 Follow the River Lecture Series, hosted by the Hudson River Maritime Museum and sponsored by Rondout Savings Bank. I'm Michael Porio, the Education Coordinator, and my fellow hosts are Carrie Gallagher, Director of Education, and our wonderful volunteer, Leslie Drojak. We're happy to be your host this evening. Before we begin, can I ask you to silence your cell phones? Thank you. The Hudson River Maritime Museum is a 501c3 not-for-profit. We do not receive funds from the city, state, or federal government, except for some periodic project-based grants. We thank Rondout Savings Bank for their sponsorship of this lecture series. We also thank you for your contributions that help support the museum. If you have not already, please sign your name at the sign-up sheet we have in the front. There you can also leave your email address if you wish to be contacted about our future lectures and events at the museum. The Hudson River Maritime Museum is located on the Rondout Creek, part of Lenapehoking, traditional home of the Lenape. We recognize the painful history of forced removal, dispossession, cultural suppression, and attempted genocide of indigenous people. By collaborating with present-day Lenape communities, culture bearers, and scholars, you're actively working to improve our exhibits, public programs, and educational resources, and help everyone better understand this important history. Just a few quick housekeeping things before we get started. Please save any questions or comments for the end of tonight's lecture. We will leave time at the end for a quick Q&A. For our virtual guests tonight, feel free to use the chat function to say hello and introduce yourselves, and to send any questions that you wish to have answered during our Q&A later this evening. Now I'd like to introduce tonight's guest. Heather Bruegl is a citizen of the United Nations of Wisconsin and first-line descendant Stockbridge Munsee. Heather is a public historian, activist, and independent consultant who works with institutions and organizations for indigenous sovereignty and collective liberation. Her research comprised numerous topics related to American history, legacies of colonization, and indigeneity, including the Dakota War of 1862, the history of American boarding schools, the missing and murdered indigenous women. Heather Bruegl, everyone.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, and hi to everyone online. I will speak loud enough that you can hear me. So I do have a pretty loud voice to start with. So hi to everyone here and everyone there. Do we have the slide? Sorry. After I said I was going to speak louder, then I don't even speak into the microphone. So I'm really excited to be here. It's my first talk down here in Kingston. Though I do enjoy Kingston. It's very cute. It's very adorable. Did not know that it used to be the state capital of New York, so I learned something new. So yeah, I'm a historian, but clearly not a good one. If I didn't know that one right away. So tonight's presentation is about land and removal from land and the fight to get it back. So we're going to cover a number of different topics. And I won't go super fast, but I'm going to go fast enough that we have plenty of time for Q&A and also just to be respectful of people's times. I like to do that. So if we could go to the next slide. Oh, wait, I have it. JK, guys. I can do it. Okay. I forget it's up there. Okay, so I was already graciously introduced, but my name is Heather. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and a first-line descendant Stockbridge Munsee. I work as a historian and an Indigenous consultant, independent. I'm not tied to any organization. When I do that work, that's my contact information up top there. You can get a hold of me through any of those mediums on Twitter. I'm not super active. Instagram. I like to bake and I have dogs, so you'll see pictures of those on Instagram. And then my website, it's just my name, heatherbruegl.com. And so those are the ways to get a hold of me. Do give me some grace if you email me and I don't get back to you right away. That inbox is always full because it's always getting emails. So just know that I will return your email as well. And if you have a question for me tonight that we don't get to, jot down my email and send it to me because I will respond to you. There we go. Okay, so the museum already did a land acknowledgement, but I just kind of want to, expand on it a little bit and talk about New York in general. So we have the Mahikaniak, which are the people of the waters that are never still, the Lenape, who are the original people. the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, and the Shinnecock people of Long Island. I think it's important that we acknowledge all of these tribes, considering um, that they're no longer here. They've been displaced in a lot of different places. So whether that's different parts of New York, Canada, Wisconsin, um, Oklahoma, the Lenape are now in Oklahoma, and it's really important to note that. And so we want to pay honor and respect to the ancestors, past and present, and we understand that this acknowledgement is just a first step in the process of building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. That is the work that I do. I work on building equitable and inclusive spaces for all people because it's important. You don't get a full story of history unless you include all of the groups together. So, Indigenous population. This is something that I like to talk about at the beginning of some of my talks because people are astonished by the number. So prior to the arrival of Columbus, 1492, um, on the high end, um, some scholars believe there were about 12 million indigenous people living here in what we call Turtle Island. However, we do know numbers were larger than that because there were villages and communities that were larger than the greatest cities in Europe at the time. So it's really more I've seen numbers as low as 12 million. I've seen numbers as high as 100 million. But regardless, there were indigenous people here before Columbus, quote, discovered this area. But by 1650, all scholars can agree that the population dropped below 6 million. And at its lowest point in the United States, the indigenous population was below 250,000 people. 250,000 at its lowest. Right now, according to the numbers in 2020, we are sitting at just over 6 million Indigenous people who fill out the census and identify that way. However, that's still only 2% of the population in the United States. 2%. This entire continent was our home, and we now only make up 2% of its people population. So that's really something to think about when we are talking about Indigenous history. What happened to Indigenous peoples? Disease, genocide, war. It was all of these things coming together, and so that's how the population ends up declining. So I want to show you this map, and I love this map because it's a movable map. So this map starts by showing Native American lands in 1794. In 1795, the US and Spain signed the Treaty of San Lorenzo that carved up much of the continent. What followed was a century of catastrophes for indigenous people as their land was taken piece by piece. And the US passed laws like the Dawes Act, which we will talk about in just a little bit. European settlers who arrived in North America found it filled with diverse, long established societies. I'll say that again, diverse, long established societies. We were already here when the New World was discovered. So later, it moves, the lands move. And what we see at the end is we see what are the reservations and what the reservation system is. But these acts and policies that the US founded and passed were the foundation upon which the United States was built about, and a foundation to which not a lot of people know about. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. The first thing we're going to talk about is the Indian Removal Act, because how did indigenous people not end up on the lands that they're on, right? So the Indian removal was signed by President Andrew Jackson on May 28th, 1830. He was not a fan of indigenous people. In fact, prior to him being president, 9 of the 11 treaties that he negotiated were actually land cession treaties. So he was able to take a lot of land from indigenous peoples even prior to being president. And so, what did Indian removal do? It granted indigenous peoples land west of the Mississippi in exchange for land that was already east of the Mississippi. So there were a number of tribes that were affected by this. You had the Choctaws, who were the first to sign a removal treaty, and they started to move west, but some stayed behind. You had the Seminole, who were coerced into signing a removal treaty. Many refused, and that led to the Second Seminole War. You had the Creeks who refused to leave, but they signed a treaty that would guarantee them protector rights over their land, but it didn't protect them from speculators. So in 1836, they were forcibly removed. After that, you had the Chickasaw, who saw the move as inevitable. They didn't resist removal. They actually signed a treaty for suitable land in the West and protection until they moved. However, white settlers were too much for the federal government to handle, and they backed out of the treaty. So the Chickasaws were actually forced to pay the Choctaws for the right to live on part of their allotment. Now, removal didn't just happen in the north or in the south, it happened in the north as well. But the tribes of here were smaller, and by 1830, many of the tribes had already been moved out of the area. So you had the Shawnee, the Odawa, the Potawatomi, and the Sac and Fox all signed treaties and moved to Indian Territory. You had the Lenape, who weren't in New York anymore. They were already farther west, but they were continued to move from Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio. The Potawatomi were forced to resettle in Kansas, and the Miami moved to Indian Territory in the 1840s. I want to briefly talk to you, though, about the Cherokee because they're a unique case. The Cherokee had a Supreme Court case. Well, they had a court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And because I'm from the Midwest, I always say it's Worcester v. Georgia, but out here in the East, apparently it's pronounced Worcester v. Georgia, which makes no sense to me. I don't understand that, but that's okay. All right. So Worcester v. Georgia was a Supreme Court case where the Cherokee used a Georgia law that stated that white settlers couldn't live on Indian land without written permission from the state. It's very black and white. You don't have permission, you can't live here, yada, yada, yada. The Supreme Court says, you know what, Cherokee Nation, you're right. And so they rule in favor of the Cherokee, which is pretty darn cool, except for the fact that after the Cherokee won their Supreme Court case, Jackson refuses to uphold the decision. So by 1838, about 16,000 Cherokee remain on their land and they refuse to move. 7,000 U.S. military troops were sent in to make the Cherokee move at gunpoint. They were not allowed to gather any of their belongings. Their homes were looted by white settlers as they left, and this is known as the Trail of Tears. And along the way, 4,000 Native Americans died of disease, cold, and hunger. And by the 1840s, with the exception of a small band of Seminoles, there were no tribes that resided in the southeastern part of the United States from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. What it also did is, so in total, 50,000 indigenous people were moved, but it opened 25 million acres of land up to the spread of settlement, but also to the spread of slavery. So two very bad things happened at the exact same time. And it's really interesting talking about it in these terms. Yesterday, I actually talked about Indian removal with a bunch of 6-year-olds. That was interesting. And I was impressed. They knew more about Indian removal than most adult groups that I speak to. So that was really cool. There was something really cool going on in that school. So that was really awesome. I want to show you this map, and this is a map of Cherokee Nation. This is the land that the Cherokee held that was so coveted by the settlers. So the map includes portions of Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky. These are the lands that were originally held by Cherokee Nation. And this is the land that was coveted most often. And that's a lot of area. I just listed off, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 states. That's a lot of area that Cherokee Nation covered. And it was prime real estate. It was prime real estate. It's good for farming. And many of the Cherokee had already had plantations that were already set up, and it was on land that was really good. And it was really successful. And so, of course, they wanted to be able to take that land. That led us to the Trail of Tears. This is considered one of the largest acts of ethnic cleansing perpetrated by the United States. And again, it began in 1830 when Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. Of course, the negotiations with tribes were corrupt and they used coercion. The treaty that the Cherokee actually signed, the Treaty of New Echota, wasn't really even signed by who the official leader of Cherokee Nation was. They grabbed whatever signature that they could get at the moment. But this map shows the different trails and different pathways that each of the 5 civilized tribes, yes, 5 civilized tribes, took in order to get to present day Oklahoma. And if you're at home, I hope you can see it very well. But there's different colored lines representing the different tribes. So, for example, Cherokee Nation is represented in yellow. And you can see that these trails went over very rough parts of the country. You know, they weren't very good parts. And then with the Seminole down in Florida, they took the Seminole across the Gulf, up the river, and then had them travel the rest of the way. I had a 6-year-old yesterday ask me, well, how did they get there? Did they drive cars or did they, what did they do? Did they take boats? And I said, well, some of them took boats. I go, but majority, you had to walk. And they were like, they had to walk all that way? I don't understand that. And I'm like, I don't understand it either, kid. If you can tell me, I more power to you. So it was awful. Again, around 4,000, probably more, indigenous people died along that trail. And that's really something to think about. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is the Dawes Act, also known as the General Allotment Act. So this was named for Henry Dawes, who was a senator from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, so not terribly far from here. I was giving a talk about the Dawes Act down. Oh, wait, I am down. So over at Marist, and one of the people in the crowd was like, "I'm from Pittsfield. I'm sorry." Like, you don't have to apologize. But Henry Dawes served in the House of Representatives. He served then as a U.S. Senator, and while he was in the Senate, he was chairman of the Committee of Indian Affairs. And he introduced acts that he thought, legitimately in his heart, that he thought were beneficial to Indigenous people. But the Dawes Act focused up breaking reservation land into allotments for individual Native Americans. The reason behind this was that if a man was given a plot of land to take care of and farm, he would dress in white man's clothing and he would eventually give up, quote, his Indian ways. All of a sudden, he would be like not an Indian anymore. Like that was the whole plan because apparently farming makes you not Indian. And so the United States then wouldn't have to act as a parent. There wouldn't be this paternalistic relationship anymore. Previous to the Dawes Act, reservation land was owned by all members of a tribal community. Well, it was really held together. Anyone who was registered on a tribal roll was eligible for an allotment. So this now brings up this idea of blood quantum. You have to be registered, you have to be on a list in order to get a piece of allotted land. And if you have questions about allotment, you can either put them into the chat or you can ask me about them later. But we could spend hours talking about quantum because it is a very complicated issue. So at first, the 5 civilized tribes that were moved to Indian Territory were exempt from this. They didn't have to deal with it at first. Also, the Seneca Nation here in New York didn't have to deal with it at first either. However, it changed later on. While this act was meant to protect Native American land rights, it did the complete opposite. The land that was allotted wasn't suitable for farming. We're talking about Oklahoma in 1887. We hadn't really quite mechanized farming yet, right? So that land is very dry and not easy to use. And also, many indigenous people couldn't or didn't want to take up farming because it wasn't their traditional way of life. And those who did couldn't afford the tools necessary to do the job. I lived for a couple of years in Wisconsin and grew up going to Wisconsin because my mom is from there. And you pass all these large farms all the time when you're driving out in the country. And there's a lot that goes into farming. There's a lot of equipment that's needed, there's a lot of money that's needed. And so you just didn't have it. There was also another Supreme Court case that came out of the Dawes Act that involved the land. And this was called Lone Wolf v. Hitchcock. And Lone Wolf was a Kiowa chief living in Indian Territory under the Medicine Lodge Treaty. And in the treaty, there was a clause that required that 3/4 of all male Native Americans living in the territory had to agree to any changes before anything was made. Well, in 1892, Congress decides that they want to open up 2 million acres of reservation land to non-native settlers. Lone Wolf files a complaint. He's like, hold the phone. You guys are like totally violating this treaty right now. And so the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court ultimately rules that Congress could dispose of reservation land without gaining consent set forth by the treaty. It also stated that Congress could void treaty obligations with indigenous tribes because Congress had inherent absolute power and the tribes had none. The inferiority of indigenous people was put on paper with the judgment in favor of the federal government. So 90,000 indigenous people were left landless. Under the Calvin Coolidge administration, later on, there was a study of the Dawes Act. And in 1928, the administration found that the Dawes Act had been used illegally. take land from Native Americans. I don't think we needed to spend federal tax dollars to figure that one out, but they did, and they found out that the land was illegally taken. And I want to say at this point, even though you have the Supreme Court ruling on these cases and you have Indigenous people, treaties being made and rights being violated, Indigenous people are not citizens of the United States until 1924. So we're being governed without any say in how we're governed because we're not considered citizens yet. So all of this is happening at a very, very important time. So the next slide I wanted to show you is a slide, this map, and the maps, just for reference, I got them from the Library of Congress website. If you Google that, and you can find them there. This map, published by the Office of Indian Affairs, was compiled and drawn by Sam Adovich, who is a Comanche, and it's an example of a map prepared exclusively by an Indigenous person for publication in the first half of the 20th century. The map is dated for 1939, and it shows a record of all tribes, reservations, and settlements in the United States and the territory of Alaska around the end of the Great Depression. It distinguishes between tribal land, reservation land, allotted in part, reservations allotted and open, colonies in Nevada, and rancheras in California. And so you can see, if you look to where Indian Territory is, Oklahoma, you've got all of those little like arrows off. Those are all tribes that were in the east that were then moved, right? So this is there's a lot in Oklahoma. Basically, the eastern part of Oklahoma is Indian Territory still to this day. You've got the large area in the Four Corners region of the United States where you've got Navajo Nation. And then you've got a lot of Indian land in the Dakotas, North Dakota and South Dakota, with the Lakota tribe. You may know them as the Sioux tribes, but they're the Lakota tribes. And then all of the rancheras in California. California is a unique case when it comes to Indigenous peoples. I'm actually, amongst other things, working on some research about that right now. And then the Pacific Northwest, where you've got a lot listed out. Notice in 1939, there's not very many in the eastern part of the United States. Here in New York, you do have some. You have the Haudenosaunee still there, but most everyone else has been removed. So when we go to the next slide, the reservation system. So there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. 229 of those reside in Alaska. That's a lot. That's a lot. What is a reservation? A reservation is a legal designation for an area of land that's managed by an Indigenous tribe under the Bureau of Indian Affairs and not by state government. This is also important to note that a common misconception is that tribal nations own their reservation land. We do not. We do not hold the title to our reservation land. The title is held in trust by the federal government. Reason being, I kid you not, we were not deemed competent enough to be able to hold the deed to our land. So the federal government had to hold it for us because I don't know what they thought we were going to do with it. Like we were going to mismanage it or something. So we don't actually own our land. You don't own land if you live on a reservation. The first reservation established in the United States was in 1851 in Oklahoma Territory, and not every tribe has a reservation. While some share land with others, and some have none at all. The largest reservation in the United States is the Navajo. The amount of land that reservations make up in the United States, you could fit it all into the state of Idaho, and it's still only 2% of the land population in the United States. The majority of reservations are west of the Mississippi. So you do have some out east, but you have a majority of them west of the Mississippi. The American Revolution could be looked at as more of a war against Native Americans than a war against Great Britain, because what were they fighting over? They were fighting over land and the right to govern themselves. But if we really stop and think about it and we want to break it apart, it was really who was going to oversee the white aristocracy and who was going to have control of the land, and it was white landowners. When the Treaty of Paris was signed, it was really understood that Indigenous people would be stripped of their property rights east of the Mississippi. I'm sure there was some thought of expanding west of the Mississippi at one point, but there was really focusing on what was happening between the Atlantic and the Mississippi, and we needed to get rid of the Indian problem. We needed these people to go away. Um, so life on reservations was hard. Native Americans were forced to live on reservations in order to continue their traditional way of life, and you were forced on it. Let me just go back a slide. There we go. Sorry. Economic issues plagued tribes, and tribes that were once nomadic lost that way of life. You also couldn't leave a reservation if you didn't have permission. It's like, remember when you're in school, you have to go to the restroom, you have to raise your hand, you got to get your hall pass. It was literally the same system for reservations. Indigenous people could not leave without permission from the Indian agent at the time. So, like your teacher or your superintendent. Um, as the Indian Wars dragged on, Congress tried to make reservations look more like white settlements. So instead of living in your traditional housing, whether that was a teepee or a longhouse or a wigwam, four wall structures that we know today were built. Men and women were taught traditional gender roles. This idea of a traditional gender role was a foreign concept to Indigenous people because men and women, radical idea, were like equal until European settlement came over. Indian agents were put in charge of reservations, and they really started to feel like you were in prison. And with the passage of the Indian Removal Act and the Dawes Act, life got even harder. Today, reservations describe life as rather trying to survive than to live. Many find community is hard to get when you're just trying to survive yourself. There's high rates of unemployment and economic hardships. There's a high dependency on government assistance. And the sense of community is there, but there's really not much else. And most reservations are located in what we would call food deserts, where you have to drive more than 30 minutes to get fresh fruits and vegetables. And it's very, very hard. They're in very desolate areas. But they're having worked on one and grown up near them, there is just such a great sense of community, and that's actually really something to see. So we with Indian relocation happened in 1956, and this was a law that was intended to encourage Indigenous people throughout the United States to leave the reservation system and acquire skills and assimilate into mainstream society. This was part of the termination policy era, and termination was a policy that was passed just before this, and that was it. What termination did is it got rid of your tribal status and also the ability to, it took more land from Indigenous people. So the benefits of relocation included providing some moving expenses, vocational training. It provided funds to buy tools. It provided a per diem for the time it took to relocate and for 4 weeks after. And it gave you grants to be able to purchase items you might need for work or for clothing and sometimes even a house. So in 1950, 6% of Indigenous people lived in urban areas. By 1951, the number kept growing. By 1960, more than 31,000 Indigenous people lived in urban areas. And between 1950 and 1980, more than 750,000 Indigenous people left the reservations and came to the cities. In the 2000 census, the urban Indian population was 64% higher than that of pre-termination. But not everything worked out when you left to come to the city. You felt isolated from your community. There was a loss of traditional culture. You faced racial discrimination and segregation. You faced job discrimination. There were fewer opportunities to advance. You could only find low-paying jobs if you could find a job at all. You faced this concept of redlining. But one thing that really happened that was really, really cool is so you might have been separated from your own home community, but there were a lot of you that were separated from your own home community. So what you did is you got together and you started to talk about issues within Indian country, and you formed these friendships, these alliances. And what came out of that in 1968 was the creation of the American Indian Movement, which is a whole other really cool talk that I do. And it's like probably one of my favorite ones to do because it talks about bringing awareness to a national level as to what was actually happening in Indian country. So they started with talking about the issues that faced the urban Indian and then moved on to sovereignty, land rights, and things like that. So it was really, really cool. So I encourage you to Google them if you want to learn more. The final thing I want to talk to you about, I did talk really fast because I wanted to make sure we had questions. But it's this idea of land back and what is it? So land back is something that came on the heels of Indigenous Peoples Day 2020. It was officially launched. And prior to that, so remember, it's 2020, we're in the middle of the pandemic. Prior to that, on July 3rd, the former president of the United States held a rally in the Black Hills in South Dakota. And the Black Hills are a sacred spot to the Lakota people. It's where they believe their great spirit resides. So it's like church, right? So there you have Mount Rushmore. And so there were land defenders who were blocking traffic for about 3 hours on their way to on people attending this rally. And they were trying to bring awareness to what was actually going on in their country, and the fact that the Black Hills had been illegally taken from the Lakota people. And so they were able to stop traffic for a little while. And so in October of 2020, the NDN collection launched something called Land Back. And in Land Back, there are four demands. There are four demands that Land Back has. And the first is to dismantle white supremacy structures that forcefully removed us from our lands and continue to keep our peoples in oppression. This includes the Bureau of Land Management and the National Parks Service. So the reason that these two areas, the Bureau of Land Management and the National Park Service, are actually talked about in this is because they stop us from being able to steward our lands, or they take our lands from us. The second is to defund white supremacy and the mechanisms and systems that enforce it and disconnect us from stewardship of the land. This includes the police, the military industrial complex, border patrol, and ICE. There are reservations that cross colonial borders. And because they cross colonial borders, you have to have ways to be able to steward your land. And if you can't steward your land because of passport issues or enhanced IDs, that stops you from being able to be in connection with your land. The third is to return, and this is very simply, all public lands back into the hands of Indigenous people. Very simple. That's very simple. And it's something that can actually be done. And it's something that is being done on smaller levels all around the country, even here in the state of New York. So it is something that can be done. That concept scares a lot of people. Return all public lands. I don't understand. Like, what do we do? Can we not go to the national parks anymore? No, absolutely. You can go to the national parks. But who better to steward them than the original caretakers of the land? So it is a concept that's something that's very real. And the fourth is consent, moving us out of an era of consultation and into a new era of policy around free and prior informed consent. Consultation implies that we've already agreed to said project. You've decided you're going to do whatever project you're going to do. You're going to now consult with a tribal nation to say, hey, we're going to do this project, but we want to make it somewhat beneficial for you. So what can we give you that will make you okay with the project? Where free and prior informed consent involves the tribal nation from the start and gives us a say and an opportunity to speak to what's actually happening. That is what they were asking for at Standing Rock during those protests. They were asking for free and prior informed consent, and it didn't happen, which is how the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers ended up plowing through a burial site because there was not free and prior informed consent. So while land back sounds scary on the surface, it's actually not, and it's actually more doable than some people think. The one of the demands is actually closing Mount Rushmore. Why would we want to close Mount Rushmore? Well, it's a big old symbol of white supremacy in the middle of sacred land, right? You have four presidents on there who had blatant disregard for Indigenous people, but also like people of color in general. Two of them were owners. So why would we want to honor that? We don't want to honor that. We want to move away from that. And prior to Mount Rushmore being Mount Rushmore, it was actually called the Six Grandfathers. If you Google pictures before of what Mount Rushmore looked like before, it's a beautiful stone mountain where you can literally almost see the faces of your grandfathers in the mountain. It's very beautiful, very spiritual. Anyone ever been to Mount Rushmore? Yeah, I did. You find it impressive? I did not find it impressive. It was small. Crazy Horse was so much better. Crazy Horse is really, really cool. I went there 3 years in a row, and of course, because the mountain is so big, it didn't look like anything had been like completed, but they'd actually done a lot. But yeah, we got to Mount Rushmore because, well, I think we maybe made the mistake of going to Crazy Horse first, and then we went to Mount Rushmore. But I was like, this number one, I thought Mount Rushmore looked incomplete, which later you find out it was incomplete, but it just is really small. And then I was just like, oh, I don't know why we still have it. We shouldn't have it. It's bad. So I like this quote because this quote really talks about the land and the importance of returning it. It's important to note that participating in returning land back to the original caretakers, it's not written off as a gift. It's not a privilege for the indigenous people. It's not supposed to relieve guilt either. Land back is the acknowledgement and thoughtfulness that goes into why we care about a place. Who is allowed to tend that place? And what does justice and healing look like for people who are forcefully removed from those lands? And this picture is actually a picture from a former ranch of about 9,000 acres in Montana that belonged to a family, and they were on their last generation and nobody wanted it. And so the person who was caretaking it at the moment was like, well, what do we do with this? And the Nature Conservancy actually approached the ranch and said, have you thought about donating the land back to the indigenous people in the area? And he was like, huh, no, I hadn't thought about that, but I think I kind of like that idea. So the Nature Conservancy bought the ranch and then assisted in the returning of the land back to the indigenous people in that area. So that is really cool. And I think it's really just important to say that I'm sure as those indigenous people at that tribal nation is walking that land, the land remembers who they are. I have to say, the first time I came out here was in July of 2021. And it was my first time to this part of the eastern part of the United States. I went to the south a lot because I had family down there, but never really came to the New York, New England area. And I have to say, it was an experience that I will never forget because the moment I stepped foot on the homelands of my ancestors, there was this automatic calmness that came over. There was this idea of being home. And it was like, I didn't know something was missing until I got here. And it's because the land doesn't forget who you are. They're waiting for you to come back. And so being able to come back and live here for a year and a half now has been the most exciting privilege of my life. And knowing that the land knows who I am and I know who it is, it's just really cool. So I digress a little, but if you like reading or watching documentaries, I'll recommend a few. So, the Lakotas, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, and An Indigenous People's History of the United States are all books that you can find from your independent bookstore if you can. I encourage you to do that. The Lakota and the Black Hills actually talks more about how the legal case surrounding the Black Hills and how it was lost, how they were lost. Obviously, the other three, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, A Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, and Indigenous People's History, are books that really just talk about Indigenous history and land, which is really cool. The reason I included The West, which is a documentary by Ken Burns, is number one, I like Ken Burns. And number two, in this particular documentary, I watched it. I was very skeptical when I started watching it because I was like, he's going to gloss over, like, Indigenous people in the West and like conquering. And he didn't. He did not at all. And I thought that was really, really cool. And I really appreciated that. So I do recommend that one. And so with that, I think I left a little bit of time for Q&A. So first and foremost, at home, thank you for taking time out of your evening. For people here, thank you for stopping in and spending a little bit of your evening with me to learn about some Indigenous history and maybe something you didn't know or get a refresher. So thank you. I'll say that now in case I forget later. And I'm open to any questions that anyone might have. There's not going to be something you can ask me that I'm going to be offended by because I've literally heard it all. Wow. Right here. Okay. So, yeah, please feel free to ask anything. And in the language of my ancestors, Onewe, Anishi, Yauko, thank you for coming here tonight, and I appreciate you.
Can I say something? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I just, as I've written a note, it's such an excellent, comprehensive talk, and I missed the first third of it probably. There's no chance of there being a transcript, is there? Because you just pulled it so beautifully together. I mean, not beautifully, so brutally together, which is much closer to the truth of what,
Yeah,
was.
yeah, there will be a recording on YouTube in about a week.
Okay. Via the museum.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Where are you speaking from now, did you say?
Oh, I'm at the museum. I'm in Kingston.
Yeah, you're actually here.
Yeah, I'm actually here in person, live and in person.
We picked a beautiful day.
Oh my gosh, I can't even believe I'm gonna say this, but it's hot outside.
Although sadly, it's not a happy sign about climate, is it really? That we've
No,
got
that makes me a little nervous that it's
Yeah.
this warm this time of the year. Yeah, makes me a
Amazing.
little nervous.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any questions from anyone in here? Yeah. I'm Oneida and Stockbridge Muncie. Yep. I don't think I'm actually familiar. Yeah, no, that was it Stockbridge, Massachusetts or Stockbridge, New York? Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Okay, because I know right after the American Revolution, the Mohican people, Stockbridge people, were moved out. Um, yeah, 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 absolutely. So I was just asked a question about the having the Muncie come and live in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, in like the 1800s. I was asked if I knew anything about that or how it would have gone because there were stipulations that were they had to be very westernized, basically. Um, I'm actually not familiar with that, but I would say just from what I am familiar with and stories that my elders have told me and things like that, that regardless of where something like that was happening, it was kind of a mixed reaction because in one breath you were getting an education and you were able to feed your children and what have you, but in another it was losing part of who you are as a person. And so I actually just had to interview one of my elders for a paper for school. And so as I was writing um the paper and she was talking to me about it, when it came talking to, like conversion to Christianity and things like that, if you ask a lot of elders, what their thought process of it is our ancestors did it to survive. They might not have necessarily agreed with or bought into, or however you want to phrase that, the idea of religion and a Christian God, but they did it as a survival mechanism, which can also be said sometimes too, why some parents actually, like, they were forced into agreeing to send their children to boarding schools because they knew that they would be fed and they would knew that they would have a place to sleep or something like that. So it's really hard, and I just have to stop and think about the choices that they made in order to survive. I'm sure it wasn't easy, but I'm not familiar with the specific incident that you're talking about, but I definitely am curious now, and will add that to my list of many things I need to research and look into. But yeah, that's interesting. I'd never heard of that. I think I'm gonna ask my elder about that. She probably would know. Yeah. Okay, yeah, cool. I'm definitely gonna look that up. I'm gonna like be at home tonight. We're gonna be watching a movie and I'll be on my phone and my husband will be like, "What are you doing?" I'll be like, "I'm researching, leave me alone." Thank you for that. Are there any other questions online or in here? Comments, concerns?
I know I'm just going to speak up. Rick Burns is on PBS tonight, a program about him on Channel 13. So whether he'll mention any of, his involvement with Indigenous people, just for anybody's information.
Thank you for sharing that. It's weird when I can hear the voice, but I can't see a person.
Another quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just do you feel that things are changing in terms of increased awareness and acknowledgement of all of this, that there has been, a change in the last, years of more awareness and more acknowledgement of what happened, at least? I mean, it's not.
Yeah, I think there has been some amount of change. I don't think it's been enough, and I think it's
No,
happening too
not
slow. So I think it's moving in the right direction. Everybody, wants to say, "Oh, well, it takes time," and I'm like, well, it's been long enough. I'm done waiting. And so while I think it's moving in the right direction, I do think we could be moving at a
not-
faster pace. But overall, I think things are going well. However, we're in a climate right now where books are being banned and curriculum is being banned, and you can't talk about certain things in school because quote too woke, when all you're really doing is talking about the truth of history and what actually happened. So we do have to combat those things, but I think eventually truth will prevail. So that's something that I am hopeful for, but that's just me talking as a person and an educator at the moment. But thank you for the question. And I think we had a question here about removal. Oh, okay. Not in Kingston. Not in Kingston, but in New York, in 2021, Papskinny Island up near Albany was returned to the Stockbridge Munsee. And what year am I in? I'm in 2023. So I think it was last year, 2022, about 1,000 acres from New York State was returned back to the Onondagas. But I'm not sure of anything down here in this area. But thank you for the question. Did you want to ask your question on removal? Okay. Mhm. Yeah, so we're indigenous people. Did they have to adapt to ways that probably weren't the most efficient other like when farming? I would say yeah. I think the way we do a lot of things is not very efficient. And I think that I think our indigenous, everything was methodical and there was a reason as to why you did things a certain way. Whether it was you farmed a certain way because farming the three sisters, right? Farming the beans, corn, and squash. There's a reason you grow those together, not because they grow well together, but each of them gives something back to the soil that you need for the next year, right?
Good answer.
That's very purposeful. There's methodology involved in that. So, I would think, yeah. I mean, when it came to boarding schools, you couldn't wear your traditional clothing because according to the US government, you couldn't learn properly if you were wearing moccasins. You literally had to like change your way of doing things. So, yeah, that doesn't seem very efficient because a child can learn, no matter what they're wearing. So yeah, there were a number of things like that. When it came to assimilation policies, there were a number of things that just weren't efficient. Anyone in here? All right. Well, thank you guys so much for coming in person, and to everyone online. I know I can't see you, but thank you so much for being here. And oh, I appreciate everyone anyone wants to learn ever about Indigenous history. So thank you so much, and thank you to the museum and Michael, Carla, and volunteers. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And try not to turn your air conditioners on. It's way too early. You don't need that bill. So, all right. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Heather. That looks like all the time we have for now. If you have any additional questions, you can email us at education@hrmm.org. Thank you so much, Heather, for joining us. Our next lecture will be hybrid, virtual, and in person on Wednesday, April 26th at 7 p.m. Harv Hilowitz will present an overview of Native Lenape history. Thank you, everyone. Good night.